Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Geocurrents lecture series on the myth of continents revisited. Today I'm going to look at the geological conception of continent, which is quite complex, and then I'm going to show how the standard continental model, especially the seven continental model, is not useful for dividing the world, either in terms of biology or in terms of humankind. And then finally, I'm going to discuss the main alternative to the continental scheme, which is the world regional system. So the question to start out with is do continents and does the continental model have geological significance? And the answer is yes, very much so, but in a complicated manner. If you read the literature on continents today, you'll find many authors claim that there are actually 8 continents. They take the standard 7 continental scheme, but they say there's another continent, which is the continent of Zealandia, which is almost entirely submerged, although New Zealand and all are part of New Caledonia are well out of the water. And you can see from this map that Zealandia is a fairly substantial continent, not quite as large as Australia, but of comparable size. So what does it mean that we have a continent, or so-called continent, which is essentially submerged or mostly submerged? Well, this has to do with the distinction, the geological distinction between oceanic and continental crust, the outermost layer of the Earth. And this diagram shows some of their most important differences. Continental crust is much thicker than oceanic crust, but it's much lighter. It's composed mostly of granite, whereas oceanic crust is composed mostly of basalt. So I have changed or amended this slide by showing submerged continental crust. It's on both sides, but I've put a dark red oval around submerged continental crust on the left. So we have sediments on top of this granitic continental crust, but the ocean level is high enough to submerge it. And so we can find these around the edges of all continents, and we find many mostly or entirely submerged areas of continental crust far out into the ocean. This diagram also shows the dynamic nature of the crust of the Earth, with new oceanic crust being formed at the mid-ocean ridges and then spreading outward. The diagram doesn't show it, but oceanic crust being lighter than continental crust will also dive under it and will become sort of submerged under the continental crust. And so we have new crust forming, but the Earth essentially staying the same size. So this is the crucial feature of how the Earth's geological system works. Now, there are some very large islands that do not have any continental crust. They form over what are known as hot spots or mantle plumes, where a hot material comes up and pushes through the oceanic crust, forming large volcanoes. So an example would be Iceland, located on the mid-Atlantic ridge, all the islands of Hawaii, including the large island of Hawaii. So they don't have continental crust, and they're considered, therefore, oceanic islands. And there's also something called continental islands, which are part of the large area of continental crust. For example, we can see on this map, and it's important to note that the ocean areas here are colored in accordance with their depth. So the dark blue areas are deep ocean, and the light blue areas are very shallow ocean. So you can see mainland Southeast Asia extends into the western part of island Southeast Asia with the Sunda Shelf. So this is continental crust, and islands of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, therefore are considered continental islands. On the eastern side of this map, you could see that New Guinea is part of the same continental crust area that includes Australia. So therefore, Australia as a continent, strictly speaking, should include New Guinea as well. And we have the broad Sahul Shelf. Then in between Australia and Southeast Asia, in this sense of continental crust, we have a number of large islands. I've noted Sulawesi. And these are noted as continental fragments. So they're composed of continental crust, but they're separated from the larger continental land masses by complex tectonic processes. Very important to note that during glacial periods, or so-called ice ages, most of the continental shelves were dry land. So much water was tied up in the massive ice caps over North America and Europe, Northern Europe primarily, that sea level dropped by a few hundred meters, exposing those continental shelves. So this map shows a situation circa 18,000 years ago, which it's important to note is very recent in terms of geological history. Over the last million years, the Earth has gone alternated between glacial and interglacial periods. We're in an interglacial period right now. Barring anthropogenic climate change, one can assume that we will be headed back into a glacial period where ice caps will form, although that's quite uncertain now. But that has been the general process. It's interesting, if you look at the map, Africa looks pretty much the same as it looks today because Africa has very narrow continental shelves. But take a look at North America, particularly southeastern United States. Florida essentially disappears. You go to the Caribbean, you have a massive island around the Bahamas. I put a white oval around Southeast Asia and Northern Australia where you could see the Sunda and Sahul shelves were dry land at this time, and there were much larger continental land masses, if you will. What does the world look like if we outline the areas of continental crust? I've attempted to do this on this map here. My apologies, it's a Mercator projection. I base this off another map, but it exaggerates the extent of land in the far north. But it's the best I could do. Anyway, how many continents would you count there? Well, one thing that's very clear is that North America and Eurasia are joined together by a quite broad, not as broad as it appears on this map, but a very broad land bridge. But really, they're essentially the same land mass when it comes to this important difference of crust. And you could see much larger Australia joining islands of New Guinea and Tasmania. You can see Zealandia. And then you can see a number of microcontinents. Microcontinents in the sense of being composed of continental crust. Madagascar would be the most prominent one. Most of these are mostly submerged. The Seychelles microcontinent, we have a scattering of Seychelles islands, but most of that's submerged. Kerguelen is a large island in the South Indian Ocean, but it's part of a much larger microcontinent, and so on. Now, connected to these features is the fact that the outermost layer of the Earth is divided into these moving tectonic plates. They due to the creation of new oceanic crust along mid-ocean ridges, and then subduction of oceanic crust underneath continental plates. Note that these plates, almost all of them, are composed both of oceanic and continental crust. They move together. So the North American plate includes half of the North Atlantic as well as most of the North American continent. Some of them are almost entirely composed of oceanic crust, like the Juan de Fuca plate off of the Pacific Northwest in North America, which is disappearing as North America moves over it. If we take this map and look at the conventional map of continents, we can see a pretty close correspondence. I should say a correspondence to a 6-continent model that puts Europe and Asia together as one continent of Eurasia. So there's a Eurasian plate, there's a North American plate, there's a South American plate, there's an African plate, and there's an Australian plate and an Antarctic plate. So it really seems to match up pretty well with the continental system, as long as it's a 6-continent rather than a 7-continent model. But that connection is not as tight as it seems at first glance. If we look at this a little more detailed map, and I've made some amendments of this. For example, first you can see, starting on the left, that much of California is on the Pacific plate, not the North American plate. They're divided along the San Andreas Fault. So Baja California through most of coastal part of Southern California, and even coastal parts of Northern California are on this Pacific plate. And you can see that most of Central America as well as the Caribbean is on a separate plate, even though southern part of Central America is, well, it's officially part of North America, but it's on a separate plate. You can see that Africa is not actually a plate. It's usually shown as one plate, but that's simplifying it. Actually, there's a Somali plate, which now is including Madagascar, which has been joined to it. There's an Arabian plate, which is separate. There's an Indian plate, which is not part of the Eurasian plate. The Indian plate is sometimes associated with the Australian plate. They used to be moving together. That's no longer true, so they're now regarded as separate plates. Note that in the far eastern part of Russia and eastern Siberia, you're on the North American plate, not the Eurasian plate. So it has a rough correspondence to the map of the six-continent map of the world, but it's just rough. And as we delve in deeper, it actually gets more complicated. There's a fantastic Wikipedia map here that I've reproduced showing all tectonic plates. So a lot of the minor tectonic plates are just ignored, but they're there. For example, in northern China and parts of Siberia, there's an Amur plate. There's a Yangtze plate in eastern China, and there are many others if you look more closely. This map bears extended study because it just includes so much information. Let's look at Africa, for example. As I mentioned before, although most maps of plate tectonics show an African plate that's actually divided between an African, although they're calling it here Nubian and Somali plates, but it's even more complicated than that. There's actually a Victoria plate sandwiched between them. So East Africa is being rifted away from the rest of Africa and eventually will form its own smaller continent. So you have the Great Rift Valley, which divides in two with very deep lakes. As that rifting process occurs. This is essentially the same rifting process that formed the Red Sea. It cuts through the Ethiopian highlands, and so this is obviously a long drawn-out process. And to look a little bit more closely at the map on the left, which shows the Victoria plate, I've highlighted the areas of divergence. And so you can see that East African rift system divides in two. And what is most interesting to my mind is that Victoria plate is actually not moving anywhere, but it is rotating in a counterclockwise direction. And you could see that on that map. There's a counterclockwise arrow just south of Lake Victoria. Lake Victoria is sort of a slump occupies a slump in between the volcanoes that emerge along this deep rift valley as this process occurs. Anyway, for another Wikipedia map, I find actually a fascinating, in many ways beautiful map. Just shows all of the areas of tectonic movement, both currently and in the past. It actually divides the world up into some 1,200 smaller plates. Like I say, not all of these are active. I use this map in a blog post on the difference between artistic maps and scientific maps that have an artistic quality to them. If I were to show people this map, I think most people would assume it's just an artist, or not, I shouldn't say just, but it is an artistic rendition of the world, but actually it's quite a scientific rendition. And different kinds of plate boundaries are shown with different color schemes, and there's just a tremendous amount of information that went into making this rather incredible map. Another thing that some cartographers have done is to make animated maps showing how the world keeps being continually rearranged through these tectonic processes. Continental blocks of continental crust separating, merging together, new oceanic crust developing, splitting continents apart, and moving them around. So the world is in continual motion, and you could trace this back for well more than 1 billion years, and you could prognosticate what's going to happen in the future as these processes continue. So on these maps, we have modern political boundaries as inscribed on top of them. I've added the labels. Dark blue areas are oceanic crust. Light blue areas are continental crusts that are covered by the ocean. And so I just go back to a period some 250 million years ago when we had essentially one continent, Pangaea, all together with an unusual shape, where especially you see areas that are now the island part of Southeast Asia were sort of in between or sandwiched between larger areas of Pangaea. Anyway, roughly 170 million years ago, the Atlantic begins to rift apart, separating North America from Africa and South America. You can see the so-called Tethys Sea in between these two blocks of continental land. And that process is going to continue. Note, I've added these labels showing Australia, Antarctica, India, Madagascar, Africa, and South America. In the late Cretaceous, this is sort of the later heyday of the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs went extinct about 66 million years ago. This is 85 million years ago. But we can see now that this rifting apart of Pangaea is continuing. This is also a period where there were very large areas of continental crust that were submerged with some broad sort of inland seas, even most of the Amazon basin. But you could see that India and Madagascar had together rifted apart from Africa, and now Madagascar is splitting apart from India. So this is a long ago. And India or South Asia is racing to the north, moving much faster than most of these continental blocks. Australia is still connected with Antarctica, but they're going to be rifting apart from each other as well. If we jump up to 30 million years ago, we see a largely recognizable world, but with some important differences. North and South America had not yet joined. So South America having been part of the southern bloc and North America the northern bloc, but they're going to join together. We can see the Tibetan Plateau beginning to form as South Asia or India on its own plate crashes into the Eurasian plate with tremendous pressure. We could see the remnant of the Tethys Sea going across the central part of what today we would call Eurasia. So the Caspian Sea would be a remnant of that. Caspian Sea being an actual lake, but it's a remnant of this old seaway. Rialco, also, I've noted here the beginning of the formation of the Antarctic ice cap. Before 30 million years ago, Antarctica was not glaciated. It was well vegetated, but that is beginning to change partly as it moves over the South Pole. So moving on to the second topic. So now we have a good sense of how geologists understand continents, which is very important, essential conceptual scheme, which only very vaguely and imperfectly maps with the continental division that we use, and only with the six-continent division. Europe and Asia have no significance here. I mean, if you go back far enough, that there had been, they were on separate plates, but it's not significant for understanding current conditions. But anyway, let's consider biogeography, the division of life on Earth. And there are many ways of differentiating biogeographical regions, large-scale regions. Here's one example for given here. So different parts of the world have different assemblages of fauna and flora, and so you can make these large biogeographical regions. They don't fit with continents. Australia does to some extent. And the reason is because Australia is an island continent. It has not been connected with other land masses for many tens of millions of years. And so, in terms of most fauna, it's still significant. Australia has a unique mammalian fauna, almost all marsupials, for example. But anyway, where we do see these divisions, but again, they don't match up with continental lines. The Nearctic or Neo-Arctic zone in North America does not include southern North America or Central America and southern Mexico, which instead is joined with South America. Now, South America and North America did have very different assemblages of wildlife until they connected. So that began about 2.7 million years ago. So they had been very distinctive, and I'll talk about that. But once they joined together, there was a tremendous amount of interchange, northern animals going south, southern animals going north. Africa, you can see there is an Afrotropical zone, but it also includes southern Arabia, does not include North Africa. Actually extends a little bit into Iran. There's a Paleoarctic biogeographical zone, which is northern Eurasia, including all of Europe, but also North Africa, and then the southern part of Asia. The Indo-Malayan zone is distinctive. This has mostly to do with climate as well as earlier connections. So really only the Australasian zone, Australia, New Guinea, New Zealand really fit the continental model. If you look at what it's called here, zoogeographical evolutionary uniqueness, how unique is the fauna, you can see that Australia really stands out. Most of Australia, at any rate, having been an island continent. And then number two would be Madagascar, which we can regard as an island continent. Continental crust, separated from Africa along with India, then separated from India, and has been sort of going its own way. A very unique assemblage of animals, particularly mammals, a limited a number of mammalian groups made it to Madagascar. They weren't there at the very beginning, and then diversified. So lemurs, tenrecs, a number of sort of uniquely Madagascaran fauna. And then you can see some uniqueness in South America, which had been an island continent, and not much for Eurasia and North America. And as I said before, when North and South America did link together, when South America ceased to be an island continent, there was this great American interchange of northern groups going south and southern ones going north. So, for example, there's the porcupine group of the rodent family, which is South American origin. We had armadillos, sloths. Today, we only have tree sloths in the tropical rainforest areas of South America and Central America, but until the end of the last glacial period, some 10, 12,000 years ago, we had a huge assemblage of ground sloths all over North America. So this was, in terms of evolutionary history, a very, very large event. A lot of species spread. A lot of them went extinct. It's interesting, before this interchange, the apex predators in South America were not mammals, but were birds, so-called terror birds. Eventually went extinct. Some of these did spread north. You could see that one of those, the Titanus walleri in the middle, was found from Texas to Florida up until 1.8 million years ago. So they were relatively successful. It's often said that they were outcompeted by the mammalian carnivores like wolves and large cats, saber-toothed tigers. Here we have a very interesting depiction of a terror bird fighting against Smilodon, a saber-toothed tiger. So, these species did go extinct on both continents, but it shows how different South America was before this joining together of these continents. As I mentioned before, North America and Eurasia are joined together by a very large bridge of continental crust, which during glacial periods, as this map shows, was dry land. So central Alaska, dry land at the glacial height, really too dry for the formation of glaciers. You can see it was separated from the rest of North America by ice sheets, but you can also see the beginning of a corridor. So as the ice sheets began to recede, and it's important to note this happened many times over the course of the Pleistocene epoch as the world went between glacial and interglacial phases, but eventually an ice-free corridor in between two main North American ice sheets will open up and allow the movement of fauna further south. These processes led to a lot of interchange of fauna, of American species and groups going to Eurasia. It's interesting, horses and camels actually evolved in North America, or largely evolved in North America. Went extinct in North America only some 10, 12,000 years ago, survived in Eurasia. And then Eurasian groups of animals, many of them moved into North America. At any rate, you end up with your, especially with your temperate and Arctic fauna, pretty similar. For example, if you look at the gray wolf map on the upper left, you can see distribution across northern North America and most of Eurasia. You could Aussies, the moose are called elk in the United Kingdom and North America and Eurasia. Yeah, you could go to the red fox. The lynx, that's different species but very closely related. Reindeer or caribou, same species. Wolverine. I mean, there are many other examples, but I just wanted to include a few. So, considering all of this complex geological history, we can get an alternative view of continents. This is a map I made probably 15 years ago, showing just an alternative view based on a polar projection so that you can see the close connection between North America and Eurasia. And because of connections between South America and North America and Eurasia and Eurasia and Africa, we really get one divided megacontinent. I put some black lines across that showing that there are divisions, both sort of physical and in other terms, but it's really one large land mass in the longer term view. And then Antarctica and Australia here I have as mesocontinents, and I've put in New Zealand and Madagascar as microcontinents, and I included New Caledonia as a nanocontinent because it's very distinctive, partly because its soils are so impregnated with nickel and other heavy metals that a variety of different plant species have evolved to survive those conditions. Just a few final words on the biogeographical significance of continents. Excuse me. As I have noted, there is some biogeographical significance to continents. A lot of these are sort of remnant because of periods of interchange. But there are some groups of animals and plants as well, but I'll just look at animals here, that reflect these very, very geologically ancient divisions. So if we go back to the early Cretaceous, we're in the Mesozoic period of dinosaurs. As Pangaea broke up, for a while there was a situation where you had essentially a large northern continent of North America and Eurasia, and then a separate massive southern continent, or Gondwana, of South America, Africa, India, Madagascar, Antarctica, and Australia. And in some groups of animals, you can still see today remnants of this division. So one good example would be in amphibians, not so much with frogs and toads, but with the other two great divisions of amphibians, the salamanders and the caecilians. So most salamanders are relatively small animals. There are some big salamanders in East Asia, but most of them are relatively small. They don't move around a whole lot, at least most of them. They pretty much stay where they are. And so there's a very slow process of salamanders moving. And they almost certainly originated in Laurasia in the northern part. And if you look at this map of their diversity, you can see eastern North America by far the most diverse area for salamanders. But also pretty high diversity. It's a bit hard to see on this map, but fairly high in the northwest of of the United States, in much parts of Europe and parts of East Asia. You have sort of moderate levels. Now, one group did cross into South America after that great faunal or American interchange a couple million years ago in the two continents, but you have very low diversity of salamanders. Only a couple species were able to move south, none at all in Africa or Australia or Madagascar, for example. Now, we have the Sicilians, which are very little known in the United States. So they're a third group of amphibians. There's the frogs and toads, there's the salamanders, and then the Sicilians. They live underground, most of them. Some are aquatic. Many of them look like earthworms that don't have eyes. Again, like salamanders, like most salamanders, they don't move around a lot, and they're very much have a distribution pattern reflecting the old Gondwana land. Some have been able to move north into Central America and into Southeast Asia as well, but almost all of them live in the old Gondwana land, particularly in the Amazon basin. There's a lot in Africa. In India, it's kind of hard to see, but there are large areas of India that have the Western Ghats, parts of the Himalayan mountain. And there are probably more Sicilians than this map shows because they're really hard to find. They live underground, most of them, and they're very, very seldom seen. There hasn't been a lot of research on it. It's interesting, there are none shown in Madagascar, but some suspect that they used to live there, and they don't have much of a fossil record, or that they may still be there. But what I have noted are the Seychelles Islands here, small islands in the Indian Ocean that have some 8 species, 3 genera. I mean, that's a little yellow dot there. Now, how could they have got to the Seychelles? How are they going to cross the ocean? Now, sometimes species like this can cross oceans if you have gargantuan floods that create these huge rafts of drowned trees and soil, and so they can move to far areas. But that's not what happened here with the Seychelles. What happened was the Seychelles is a microcontinent. One thing you could tell that it's not, and the Seychelles are not normal oceanic islands just by the rock with these large granite rocks. That's continental crust. And it's certainly not going to be found in oceanic islands. And as these maps show, the Seychelles are a little microcontinent that were part of this block of continental crust, included India and Madagascar, got separated by faulting and ended up with this separate little microcontinent in the Indian Ocean with its Sicilians. And as a final note, I'm getting off of continents, but I find this too fascinating to leave apart. And I put here, for some inexplicable reason, many people find Sicilians off-putting. For example, in much of India, where people will honor and protect cobras, which kill a lot of people in India every year and are obviously deadly poison. People, if they ever see one of these, will kill them on sight. They're considered to be highly venomous. They're not venomous at all, but they're hated. And why is this? Well, there are many different kinds of Sicilians. They have very different looks. Some look sort of like eels and are aquatic, but many Sicilians look more like this. They're blind. They're soil predators eating earthworms and various soil invertebrates, and they have relatively fearsome teeth. So I've shown these pictures to many people, and they're almost all horrified. Anyway, one final note on Sicilians, they are noted for their maternal care. Ring Sicilians, the mother Sicilians, will create a new layer of skin, which is then eaten by their young, and they'll just keep creating skin to feed them. And it's recently been found some of them produce a substance very much like milk. It's excluded from their anus, or their cloaca, as I believe it's called, and the young will come around it and eat these lipid and protein-rich secretions from the mother. So milk or milk-like substances they're definitive of mammals. Pigeons also produce a kind of milk, a crop milk, and that was thought to be the only other example. Well, now we know these Sicilians do it. But anyway, getting back to continents. My next big topic here is whether the continental model is useful for dividing the human world, and I have an emphatic no. It's simply not, and it isn't used. For example, Mexico and Central America are part of North America, but do they fit in terms of human geography better with the rest of North America, or do they fit with South America? Or to put it in another example, let's take Peru in South America. What is it more similar to other South American countries like Guyana, Suriname, or as I have here on the map, France? Because French Guiana is an integral part of France. It's as much part of France as Hawaii is part of the United States. We almost never map it that way, but it is the geopolitical truth. So you have Peru, Spanish, largely Spanish-speaking country with a number of indigenous languages, which had been the center of very powerful indigenous states before the Spanish conquest, and still reflected in its human geography. So Mexico and Peru have a great number of commonalities in terms of their cultural constitution and background, whereas Guyana and Suriname, most of the population is descended from people from Africa and from India, for South Asia, after the end of slavery. People from Indonesia, and in the case of India, and in the case of Suriname, Indonesia, were brought in by colonial governments to cut sugarcane. French Guiana, also a very population mostly of enslaved African descent. Languages in Guyana would be English and various Creole languages. In Suriname, Dutch is official. Most people speak Creole languages, which are derived from European languages, English and Spanish and Portuguese more than Dutch, though, and African languages as well. So they're really very distinctive, and saying that they're all South American countries, including Peru, tells us absolutely nothing. And we could do the same thing with North Africa. Where does it fit better, with sub-Saharan Africa or Africa south of the Sahara, or with the Middle East, which is technically in Asia? Or we can do the same kind of map. What is Tunisia most similar to in terms of human culture and history, politics, economics, whatever we want to look at? Is it more similar to Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, or Ethiopia, which is very distinctive, or Madagascar? Madagascar was not settled by human beings until around 1,500 years ago, and the first people who got there were from what is today Indonesia. And then later people came from Africa. And today the people of Madagascar have a genetic descent that's roughly half Southeast Asian and half African. But what does it have to do with North Africa? Whereas if we can compare Tunisia with Jordan in Asia, in Southwest Asia or the Middle East, we see an awful lot of similarities in terms of Arabic language, Sunni Islam. One could go on and on. And then we have to ask, so the Middle East, I have here in red both what is usually considered the Middle East, although the Middle East also includes Egypt. Here we just have the Asian part of the Middle East, and the three countries of the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And I have to ask, are they ever really viewed as parts of Asia? Are there people classified as Asian? I mean, what does it mean to call those areas parts of Asia? And I would respond that it doesn't mean anything at all, because Asia is not really a legitimate unit in terms of human geography. And note that more than half of the world's population lives in Asia. And would we ever call an immigrant to the United States from Lebanon or Turkey or Iran, would we consider them Asian or Asian American? I mean, no. It's interesting, too, when you call someone an Asian or of Asian background, in the United States and the United Kingdom, it tends to mean something very different. In the United States, if someone is considered Asian American, their ancestry is almost certainly from East Asia or Southeast Asia. Someone from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, I find would rarely be called an Asian or an Asian American, where in the United Kingdom, when they refer to someone as Asian, they almost always mean they're from South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or India. And this has to do with British colonialism in South Asia and a variety of different topics I don't have time to go into. So I'd say that this continent of Asia really has no utility. It doesn't help us understand the world at all. It's a remnant of ancient Greek geography, really, which I explained in the first lecture in this series. Or how about the fact that we have dual continent countries? That Egypt divided between Africa and Asia, the Sinai Peninsula, it's to the east of the Gulf of Suez and the Suez Canal. Turkey, we have a little bit of European Turkey because that's to the west of the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, these waterways that connect the Mediterranean to ultimately to the Black Sea. We have Kazakhstan mostly in Asia, but it has a European part because the Ural River that divides them, and that passes through Kazakhstan or Europe, or Russia, with its European Russia and Asiatic Russia or Siberia along the Ural Mountains. It's interesting. Russian geographers really like the idea of dividing Europe from Asia at the Ural Mountains. I'm talking about those in the 18th, 19th centuries rather than along the Don River or other divisions that had used previously. Russia began in the European part. Russia began to conquer Siberia in the late 1500s. It was really over by the end of the 1600s. At the same time that the French and British were colonizing Canada, the Russians were taking over Siberia, mostly for the fur trade. But it's a vast amount of land. But today, what does it mean that we have Asiatic Russia? Does it mean that the people there are Asiatic in some sense, and those in the European part of Russia are European? No, it doesn't at all. Actually, if we look at ethnicity and we look at ethnic Russians in the Russian Federation, those who speak Russian as their first language, we find that Asiatic Russia is more Russian than European Russia. European Russia has some very large non-Russian groups like the Volga Tatars or the Chechens and English. There are many of these. And there are a lot of these groups in Siberia, but they're much smaller population. So again, the percentage of ethnic Russians is higher in Asiatic Russia. So it doesn't mean really anything that Russia is a dual continent country, or Kazakhstan or Turkey or Egypt for that matter. Russia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Egypt are continentally divided because Asia is supposedly defined on physical rather than human criteria. And these are not major physical criteria. I talked about this in the first lecture, looking at the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, the Caucasus Mountains are pretty significant. But these are geophysical rather than human divisional grounds. Now, note on this Wikipedia map, Indonesia is also continentally divided. We see the main parts of Indonesia, the big islands of Sumatra, Java, southern 3/5 of Borneo, Sulawesi, and so on, as part of Asia, but not New Guinea. But Indonesia includes the western part of New Guinea. And so here we have the Wikipedia is continuing to use these physical features because, as I mentioned before, all of New Guinea is, in terms of the geological definition of continent, connected with Australia. That's term rather than with Asia. But there's a big but here. On almost all the maps of continents you can find, it is New Guinea that is divided, and it's divided on geopolitical grounds, not geophysical grounds. Just do an image search of continents and you'll find the vast majority of maps are like this. All of Indonesia considered part of Asia. And the eastern part of New Guinea, which is the core of the independent country of Papua New Guinea. It also includes some islands, some large islands like New Britain, New Ireland, Bougainville. That is usually considered part of Australia, or as it's sometimes called, Oceania, as a largely non-continental continent. So why is this? Well, it goes back to the late 1800s when New Guinea was divided. The Netherlands, which controlled Indonesia, taking the western half. After Indonesia became independent, after World War II, 1949, I believe. Indonesia did not include this area, but Indonesia's leaders demanded it. They demanded all the areas that the Dutch had conquered, and in 1963 were able to take it. There's a there's a long brewing and long lasting insurgency there. However, as most of the indigenous peoples resent the fact that that area was taken over by Indonesia, but migrants from the rest of Indonesia are moving in and changing the demographic balance. The independent country of Papua New Guinea in the east, this had been in the late 1800s divided between Germany and the United Kingdom after World War I. Those areas were united, put under Australian rule, and then eventually became independent. So New Guinea is divided on geopolitical grounds, and the continent of Asia ends up being divided on geopolitical grounds in most maps, even though continents are supposed to be divided on geophysical grounds. So anyway, as I said before, in short, the continental model is a conceptual mess. It's not useful. I also note on this map, a lot of the maps you see don't even actually get the conventional mapping right, because this one puts Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, areas just south of the Caucasus, as parts of Europe, where on geophysical grounds they are almost always, although not quite always, grouped with Asia. But because of this, I would say serious writers, scholars, diplomats, other serious thinkers have not used the continental model since World War II. If you go back to the period, the early 20th century, early 1900s, you'll look at geographical textbooks, for example, you'll find they're mostly organized on continental lines. After World War II, that ceases. And it was during the war when, under the auspices of the U.S. federal government, the Smithsonian and other organizations created what they called the Ethnogeographical Board, basically to remap the world, because the continental framework was not useful in the struggle of World War II. The U.S. government thought that a more culturally and historically cognizant model should replace it, and so scholars were brought together literally to remap the world. One of the issues here was Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia had not really been used as a region of the world. The term goes way back, but a writer in the mid-1800s who wrote about Southeast Asia could be talking about southern China or eastern India. It was, this is the vague southern and eastern part of Asia, and that could include southern China or eastern India. But the area that we now call Southeast Asia was generally considered Indochina or further India. The islands were called the Indies. In the early years of early 1942, Japan overran all of that area. So the red here shows Japan's very brief colonial empire during World War II, all the areas that they conquered from China and from the European powers. And they basically controlled Southeast Asia as part of their what they call the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. And so it was a very distinctive theater of war. And so the Ethnogeographical Board, one of the things they did was differentiate this Southeast Asia area, part on the mainland, part in the islands. I put a black line around it to show this region. So as I just mentioned before, in earlier times there was no real concept of Southeast Asia. The map we have on the left shows from the mid-1800s shows Hindustan or farther India. So Hindustan being what we would today call India, as well as Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan. And then farther India being what today would be called mainland Southeast Asia. And then island Southeast Asia or insular Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Philippines especially, and some other countries, Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, which is generally called the East Indies. The eastern islands of India, the West Indies being the Caribbean, going back to the original European encounter when, before the fourfold division of the world separating the Americas from Asia, Africa and Europe was created. So out of this ethnogeographical board came the world regional model. Now it uses continental terminology but divides and recombines the continents. So North America just limited to U.S., Canada, and Greenland. That leads to a conceptual problem. When someone says North America, well, what do you mean by North America? Do you mean the whole continent? Do you mean the U.S. and Canada along with Mexico, as in what used to be called the North American Free Trade area? Or do we simply mean mostly English-speaking North America, U.S. and Canada? So Latin America, based on Spanish and Portuguese, closely related languages, both derived from Latin, as is French, of course, as a world region. And then Africa is divided between sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa goes with the so-called Middle East. We had in the Cold War Western Europe, and then the USSR and its satellite states of Eastern Europe were all grouped together as a world region. I've left Yugoslavia and Albania in gray because no one really knew where to slot them. They had communist governments but were not under USSR Soviet influence. Then South Asia, essentially the Indian subcontinent, sometimes extending as far as Afghanistan, but with India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Maldives Islands. East Asia, essentially China, Korea, and Japan. Southeast Asia, which I've already discussed. And then Australia, Papua New Guinea, New Zealand usually put in as Australia, or Australasia, Oceania, some other term. So the terminology is obviously based largely on the continental vocabulary, but this is not a map of continents by any stretch of the imagination. There are many interesting things about this world regional model. One is it's been adopted by people all over the world. Not everybody by any means, but a lot of political leaders really use it. The best example of this is ASEAN, or the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And it uses the conventional definition of Southeast Asia that emerged out of the ethnogeographical board. All countries in Southeast Asia except East Timor are now members of this organization, and East Timor is eligible, and it's on the list to become part of ASEAN because it is part of Southeast Asia as conventionally defined. Now, what I have noted here on the map here is that Sri Lanka is not eligible to join. It's classified as part of South Asia. It has in the past made some overtures to ASEAN to join with it, and it does have some very close connections, particularly with the four countries of mainland Southeast Asia: Burma or Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, because along with Sri Lanka, the majority of their populations in all these countries follow the Theravada or Hinayana version of Buddhism, quite different from the Mahayana Buddhism of East Asia, which would include, in this sense, Vietnam. So there are a lot of pretty deep cultural connections between Sri Lanka and, let's say, Thailand and Burma. But when Sri Lanka asked about possibly joining, they were told, no, how can you? You're South Asia, not Southeast Asia. Anyway, after the end of the Cold War, when we have follow the Soviet Union, the extension of European institutions like the EU into what had been part of the Soviet bloc, we have a sort of a remapping of the world. This map is much less certain than the other one, the previous one, and I'll talk about some of the uncertainties in the next map. The biggest difference from the Cold War map, though, is Central Asia reappears on the map. It had been countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. It had been Soviet republics, and obviously put in part of the Soviet Union. They're quite distinctive from Russia in terms of historical and cultural geography. Turkic, or in the case of Tajikistan, Persian-speaking countries, Islamic heritage, and so on. So it is often sort of emerged as an old but new world region, if you will. Uh, Otherwise, pretty similar, but let me just show you some areas that are sort of have an uncertain position on this map. So starting in the west, all of the Caribbean islands, the three Guyanas in South America, Belize in Central America, these often are separated from Latin America. They don't have the Spanish and Portuguese linguistic and colonial history, except Cuba and Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. So some of these islands do, most of them don't. Many scholars would argue there's a very distinctive Caribbean background having to do partly with extensive movement of people from Africa during the Atlantic slave trade, and in many areas later movement of people from South Asia, from India and Southeast Asia, Indonesia, to places like Guyana and Suriname, and into some of the Caribbean islands as well, Trinidad as well. So sometimes this is put as a separate world region. In Africa, I have Sudan and Mauritania. They're most often put in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of the people do live south of the Sahara, but they're both primarily Arabic-speaking countries, and so in many areas fit much better. I have Ukraine here in gray. Well, it's obviously contested. The view from Moscow is it's part of the Russian world region. The view from Kiev is it is no, it is belongs with Western Europe, and obviously it's being fought over. I have the three Transcaucasus countries. That's Transcaucasus, meaning the other side of the Caucasus from the perspective of Moscow. That's Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Don't really fit with the Middle East. People in Georgia, certainly, most of them would want to be included as part of Europe. Georgia, a country of primarily Christian, Eastern Orthodox religious affiliation. Armenia also largely Christian, although Azerbaijan is mostly Sunni Muslim, although probably the least devout Muslim country in the world. Afghanistan, some uncertainty as well. Sometimes it's put with South Asia, sometimes with Central Asia, sometimes with the so-called North Africa and Southwest Asia or the Middle East. Mongolia usually put in East Asia, but historically it has closer connections with Central Asia. Vietnam has very close historical and cultural connections with East Asia in terms of its old writing system, not its current writing system, but its older one, Mahayana Buddhism, Confucianism, and so on. Madagascar, with its sort of unique cultural background, spanning Southeast Asia and Africa. New Guinea and other islands in the Pacific, too, they really belong with Australia, places like Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and so on. So there's a lot of uncertainty. I would actually prefer a modified world regional map. I show it here. I say good luck with that because it's not going to be adopted, but that's the one that I would use. That's far from perfect. That's got all sorts of problems, as any map like this would, trying to divide countries when the countries themselves often are divided among more than one group. And that's something I haven't emphasized, though, but these world regional models are essentially based on geopolitical features, not on geophysical features. So I haven't divided any countries. Sometimes it might be a good idea. I've in a textbook that I was long a co-author of, we took parts of western parts of China, like Xinjiang, which is mostly, its indigenous population is Muslim and Turkic speaking, and we put that with we put it both in East Asia and in Central Asia, so we divided it in that sense. We did the same with Tibet. That was not popular in China. We got a lot of flack from that. But I'd probably be happier, at least, especially if I'm talking about deeper historical patterns and processes. I'd be more likely to put Southeast Asia with East Asia, but it really belongs in both regions. And so you can't really capture that in a map like this. I've distinguished the Horn of Africa partly because Ethiopia and Eritrea have very different, deep cultural and historical differences from the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. I've called Madagascar and some of the smaller islands of the Indian Ocean, like Seychelles, um, particularly Mauritius and Réunion. Réunion being part of France, I've called that Indo-Africa. And I have Oceania here, which I'm distinguishing, and very controversial. I have a North America and Australasia, putting in North America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand on the basis of similar historical, cultural connections. Are obviously far separated by oceanic space. And some critics have said, well, why don't you put the United Kingdom in this if you're going to talk about English language and so on? So these are problems that can't be solved. I did that partly just to be provocative and have a different view. As I also separated the Arabic-speaking countries. Well, Israel is in there as well. Israel formerly used Arabic as an official language alongside Hebrew, but that ended a few years back. But it's obviously deeply imbricated in that Arabic-speaking realm. And I've separated Turkic and Iranian-speaking countries, and I put Mongolia in here. So it's just an experiment, and one can do this kind of mapping in many different ways. Ultimately, that's not what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is just outright geographical ignorance or illiteracy. And more than anything else, what I want is simply a return to some real geographical education. And that a real geographical education, you wouldn't just take the continental scheme as a given. You would interrogate it and look at it and show its problems and show why it is not used. And even for kindergartners, I think we can do this. We shouldn't just tell them there's a continent of Asia when there really isn't. I think that's miseducation in its own right. But the geographical illiteracy in the United States is extreme. And I'll just give you a couple examples. This was from back in 2014. I believe it was a Washington Post poll. This was when Putin first invaded Ukraine and took over Crimea and the Donbass area, or part of the Donbass area. And Americans were just simply to ask, oh, here's a blank map of the world, outline map of the world, put a dot where Ukraine is. Notice a number of people placed it somewhere in the middle of the United States, even more in Alaska, central part of Greenland. You know, you're on top of 5,000 feet of ice. A lot of people put Ukraine there. The closer they are to actual Ukraine, they've changed the color scheme, and so the farther away you are, you have blue, and then you get into this sort of maroon color around Ukraine itself. But the basic thing is Americans have no idea of where Ukraine is, or Iran, or any other country, really, almost any other country. The map is a mystery. And it's a mystery to most Americans, but even to highly educated people, even to people in the top ranks of the U.S. government, they may not be this ignorant, but the ignorance is still pretty overwhelming. And it's often demonstrated of Senate leaders who really don't know anything about Iran. Democrats will tend to highlight Republicans' ignorance, and Republicans will emphasize Democrats' ignorance, but it's bipartisan. I've written articles before. I won't delve into them deeply, but we had statements from many American presidents in both parties that just really indicated a profound lack of understanding of the world. Many of these resulted in major embarrassments and problems. There's one very interesting case of, I may go back to the Lyndon Johnson administration. I'm not sure, but the government was hosting a delegation from Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and the U.S. delegates thought they were from Mauritania in West Africa, countries that are absolutely different, and just resulted in this, humiliating and actually bizarrely funny encounter. So my big question is, can this overriding geographical ignorance be addressed? And I'm not really very hopeful about this, because it seems like knowledge of students, at least that I've encountered coming into university, and I've recently retired, but I had decades of teaching. It just seemed like every year American students knew less and less about the world. And more problematic than that is we seem to revel in our ignorance. It's funny. It's a source of a joke. And really, in a way, you have to laugh at it. You're going to laugh or cry. Well, maybe it's better to cry. But there's a whole YouTube genre of humor about how little people in the United States know. We have Jimmy Kimmel does this often, evidently. And we have a map of the United States. Hint, you are here. We have someone pointing at South America and calling it China. College students can't name one country, or another American's failing at geography. Again, this is all over the place. And I just don't see any efforts to change it. I wrote The Myth of Continents more than a quarter of a century ago, and I don't know, I thought maybe it would lead to some change, and it's been a pretty successful, quite successful book. It's still in print, it still sells copies, it's widely cited, but has it had any impact whatsoever in elementary geographical education? Well, the answer is no. None whatsoever. It doesn't matter that continents don't really have reality, especially the 7-continental model. It doesn't matter that they're not useful. That's still what we teach. We start in kindergarten. Here are the 7 continents, and we don't go much further than that. 100 years ago, we did. There are circulating on the internet a number of geography exams from the 8th grade, where, yeah, of course, they had a lot of problematic assumptions about the world, but students were expected to have a good sense of the map of the world and how the world is put together, and we lost all of that. I will explore that in some later writing. I would say that, just to end this lecture and slideshow, if geographical illiteracy really is to be addressed, I think we need to start in kindergarten in the 1st grade. And that's one of my projects for the summer. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, and I'm going to be teaching her a variety of things this summer, including basic literacy and numeracy, but geography as well. And I hope to do some posts on geocurrents about the lessons that I come up with. I've been collecting curricular material for grade school students, looking at it, and there's some good material out there, but I think we could do much better, and I hope to. Well, we'll see how that works out. At any rate, thanks for watching this, and I hope you could watch the first part of this lecture if you haven't, and I hope you look forward to some more geocurrents lectures in the future.